Ever since Russia valiantly retreated back to Belarus after the Battle of Kyiv, there have been rumors that Vladimir Putin would force his client state to join the war. This would be catastrophic for all involved and could end up happening nonetheless. Belarus's importance in this war can't be understated. The nation has been a staging ground for Russia's invasion of Ukraine and is now one of the most important logistical bases for the entire Russian war effort. It was from Belarus that Russia attempted its mad dash to Kyiv, hoping to end the war in 3 days. And it was the safety of Belarus that sheltered rapidly retreating Russian forces after the Battle of Kyiv failed. Without the safety of technically neutral Belarus, Russian troops could possibly have been routed, leading to the worst defeat of a Russian field army since World War II. The Battle of Kyiv highlighted just how important the country was to the entire war effort. Russia's biggest problem in this war is its terrible logistics and its equally terrible ability to protect those logistic hubs and networks from Ukrainian attack. But Belarus is basically like home base for the Russian army when you played tag in grade school. No tagging or bombing allowed, so Russia is able to maintain supplies close to the Ukrainian front and continues to use the country as its own little warehouse to this day. It was logistical issues that forced the retreat from Kyiv more so than a Ukrainian military victory. But without the friendly nation and multiple supply hubs next door, Russian troops in retreat would have been forced to trek hundreds of miles through hostile Ukraine to get back to safety. The entire way they would have been hounded by very maneuverable Ukrainian forces, which wreaked havoc on retreating Russian forces retreating north from Kyiv and across the border. Without committing major combat power from the eastern theater into an attempt to break through the eastern lines and create a safe corridor for the Kyiv assault forces, Russia would have lost the entire 15,000 to 30,000 estimated soldiers on the offensive. But the rescue attempt would have weakened Russia elsewhere along its eastern front line, completely reshaping the Ukrainian war as we know it and potentially leading to a catastrophic early defeat of the Russian military. At the bare minimum, the Kremlin would have been hard-pressed to explain to its citizens the complete loss or capture of 30,000 soldiers in the first month of fighting. Belarus being right across the border, though, was a get-out-of-jail-free card for Vladimir Putin and his terrible tacticians who put the whole debacle together. And since then, Belarus has been one of Russia's greatest advantages. Ukraine is not allowed to attack into Belarus, not so much for fear of the Belarusian military, more on that soon, but because its Western partners would get very frowny-face about it. But Belarus is neutral like the sea is dry, and Russian assets use the nation to safely launch attacks against Ukrainian cities, and occasionally, probably by accident, at military targets. This is a maddening situation for Ukraine, which can't even risk taking action against Russian jets over Belarusian territory lobbing long-range missiles for fear of causing an international incident. With the ability to stage forces in Belarus, Russia also forces Ukraine to commit a percentage of its military to protecting the border, just in case the Russians are stupid enough to try to have a go at Kyiv again. This eats up manpower that's badly needed in the front, even if the possibility of a cross-border attack is so low that Ukraine typically sends units on rest there. As the war goes from bad to worse for Putin, he's put significant pressure on Belarus to join it, and so far, it's resisted. But this may not last for long. Belarus's president Alexander Lukashenko has ruled over the country since its independence from the Soviet Union, when Belarus missed out on that whole freedom thing going around. Since then, Lukashenko has basically turned Belarus into a Russian simp, despite vigorous political opposition that he either exiles, murders, or jails with impunity. In 2020 and 2021, Belarus exploded into protests when Lukashenko miraculously and totally not suspiciously won the majority vote again in a landslide election. The protests would come to be known as the Anti-Cockroach Revolution, after a children's poem in which a tyrannical yet fragile cockroach ruled over all the animals briefly until a sparrow realized he could just eat it. As the anti-Lukashenko fervor swept the country, the dictator blamed the growing protests on the Americans, and on NATO, and on the Ukrainians, and on the Russians, and on the Harlem Globetrotters. There was literally nobody Lukashenko wasn't blaming apart from himself. Soon, the protests threatened to turn into a full-blown civil war, and much to Lukashenko's relief, the military and security services remained loyal, arresting, beating, raping, and killing thousands of civilians. Vladimir Putin was also swift to dispatch Russian aid, with Russia's support being the only thing preventing a complete collapse of the Belarusian government. And since then, things have quieted down significantly in Belarus, with most of the opposition either in jail or in exile. But that doesn't mean everything is sunshine and rainbows for Belarus, and opposition to both Russia and Lukashenko remains so high that if the country were to join the war in Ukraine, the results might not be to either Lukashenko or Putin's liking. When rumors were swirling in late 2022 of Belarus joining the conflict, multiple polls leaked out of the country showing that many in the nation believed that if their military was asked to fight, the soldiers should either refuse or defect. That is an astonishing result from a significant segment of the population. And Belarus was quick to declare the results an invention by the West. However, the fact remains that Lukashenko has so far rebuffed Putin's attempts to get the Belarusian military into Ukraine, and one has to wonder exactly why. For a while, late in 2022, it seemed like Belarus would actually pull the trigger on destroying itself by joining the war in Ukraine. Lukashenko had basically given the Russian military free rein over the nation, with Russian troops free to go wherever they pleased and do whatever they wanted without needing to notify or even gain approval from local authorities. In exchange, Russia had granted a stay on Belarus's loan repayments, and it even granted another loan to the tune of $1.5 billion. Meanwhile, Lukashenko was launching what appeared to be a secret mobilization of the military and security services, with military members and police officers recently receiving summons notices. More military medics were put into training, and a percentage of the population were notified that they could be called up in the first wave of a possible mobilization, which would of course only be in the case of a national catastrophe. Rumors began to circulate that Belarus was anticipating an attack from Ukraine. Indeed, Belarusian intelligence began to visit state-owned enterprises to warn them of just such a pending attack. The stage had been set, and Western intelligence warned that Russia could carry out a false flag attack inside of Belarus to stir the nation into joining the war. This is pretty much textbook for Russian intelligence services, who have not shown a great degree of imagination throughout this conflict. However, the expected attack never came. This might be because Russian intelligence wasn't planning a false flag attack after all, and instead it was all the product of a Lukashenko fever dream where Ukraine really was preparing to invade. The man is notoriously paranoid, and when most of your country hates you and wants you dead, it's easy to see why. However, the more likely reason said attack never came is because Russian intelligence simply never carried it out, because Putin and Lukashenko both realized that mobilizing Belarus to war could very well end up costing Russia the war and Lukashenko his head. For starters, the Belarusian military isn't exactly a war-winning force, unless that war is against efficiency and competency, in which case they'd give the Russians a run for their money. The nation is ranked as the world's 60th military power, 3 spots down from the mighty military powerhouse of Azerbaijan. It has an active duty military of 45,000 soldiers, of which only 16,500 are in the army. It's estimated that only 15,000 of those are ready for combat, in the sense that they have a rifle issued to them and could be mobilized quickly, not that they're trained or equipped properly for actual combat. Military analysts have compared Belarus's military to the conscripted forces Russia's been hurling into the war since the summer of 2022. The nation does have an air force made up of 18,000 personnel, with an inventory of 34 MiG-29s, 67 Su-25s, and 4 Su-30s. However, its MiG-29 fleet received its latest upgrade in 2004, and even then only 13 aircraft received that upgrade. What Belarusian jets don't crash on takeoff could still complicate Ukraine's air defense picture, at least for a few weeks, until they've all been shot down or simply worn themselves out. With sanctions from the West on both Belarus and Russia, both nations are having significant difficulties in procuring replacement aircraft parts or the materials and tools needed to create new ones. The country does have a significant force of T-72 tanks, though an estimated 100 of its 800 or so strong fleet have been donated to the Russians. This could pose another challenge for Ukraine, except for one thing. Since 2021, Belarus has maintained its operational units at only half strength. This means that half of the Belarusian military is in reserve status, and making the entire thing completely unprepared for combat operations of any kind. Training is sparse to non-existent, and any attempt for the Belarusian military to get into fighting shape would necessitate at minimum weeks of reorganization, let alone months of training for its units. To be fair, lack of training has never stopped Russia from throwing meat into the meat grinder of Ukrainian guns, and there is little reason to expect Belarus wouldn't behave the same way. But Belarus would be facing a strategic quagmire if it were to join the war. First, it would have to punch through significant Ukrainian defenses. Since Russia retreated from Kyiv, the Ukrainians have destroyed bridges and mined roads between itself and Belarus. Miles upon miles of anti-tank ditches and defensive trenches line all approaches into Ukraine, and Ukraine's access to Western equipment would give the Belarusian military a lethal problem to overcome. And then there's the actual terrain itself. All along the border with Belarus is some of the most inhospitable terrain in Europe, with vast swamps and bogs stretching into both countries. The terrain is so awful that both the Russians and the Germans completely avoided it during their minor disagreement in World War II. Only partisans flocked to the area known as the Pripyat Marshes, one of Europe's largest marshlands. The Ukrainians also have one significant ally that's helped build up defenses in the north: beavers. The vast marshes are home to a massive beaver population, and beavers can't stand running water. Like T-Mobile and good reception, beavers and water are mortal enemies. In the pre-war years, though, beaver dams were kept under control and regularly dismantled to prevent nature's furry little engineers from causing massive flooding and wreaking general havoc on local road and rail infrastructure. However, since the fighting began, nobody's been taking apart the beaver dams, and this has only made the marshes an even more treacherous obstacle for any military to cross. Even with light opposition, the element of surprise, good roads, and few if any prepared defenses, Russia managed to completely bungle its attempts to invade Kyiv. The result of Belarus trying the same thing without the benefit of safe roads against dense Ukrainian defenses and through murky marshlands would be so catastrophically hilarious we really wish the Russians would give it a go instead. The Belarusian military can't join the fight because it physically can't get to the fight unless it sent its personnel to invade through Russian corridors instead. And this is where we get to the real reason why Belarus won't join the fight. Lukashenko knows that his people hate him, and the only thing keeping him in power is the loyalty of the military and security services. If he sent that military and a significant amount of his security services to go camping in Ukrainian swamps, the nation would explode in protests, and this time, there wouldn't be many loyalists left to protect Lukashenko and his regime. That is, if most of the military didn't simply immediately mutiny the moment they were told to join the horror show going on across the border. A Chatham House poll showed that 90% of Belarusians completely rejected joining the war on Russia's side. The poll also showed that only 16% of Belarusians thought the consequences of Russia's war would be positive for Belarus or them personally. Confidence in an ultimate Russian victory only hovered around 38%, and only 9% polled believed there was any chance of Belarus joining the war. When asked what the military would do if it was told to join the war against Ukraine, only 18% of people believed the military would actually follow that order. 20% expected the military to refuse outright, 17% thought the military would participate but only in a non-combat role, another 17% believed many would simply flee from Ukraine, and 8% thought the military would simply surrender to Ukrainian forces. 49% of Belarusians supported the military simply refusing to fight against Ukraine. Perhaps most disturbing, though, is an upwards trend since the start of the war showing that 11% of Belarusians supported Belarus leaving the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization and joining NATO instead. The implications are clear. The Belarusian people would in no way support their military going to war against Ukraine. Not only are the Belarusian armed forces even more poorly trained and equipped than Russia, but the threat of outright mutiny is exponentially greater. Any move to join the fighting would likely end up with the collapse of the Lukashenko government, and yet Lukashenko finds himself between a rock and a very hard place. If Russia loses the war, as it will inevitably do as long as Western support for Ukraine holds, then Lukashenko's regime will similarly collapse as Russia descends into political turmoil. But at that same time, Lukashenko can do little but offer basing rights for the Russian military because sending his army to join the fighting would be tantamount to national suicide. Lukashenko isn't a complete fool either. He's seen what Wagner did to Russia and what Ukraine helped the Free Russian Legion and Russian Volunteer Corps do in their multiple invasions into Belgorod. If Belarus were to join the war, there would be no shortage of Belarusian volunteers to carry the fight back across the border, and unlike Russia, the nation doesn't have the resources to repel these types of incursions, especially not when a significant percentage of its own military is in outright rebellion and looking for an excuse to defect in order to avoid fighting in Ukraine. With opposition leaders in exile who still enjoy a high degree of popular support inside Belarus, any weakness within the nation would be inviting a full-blown insurrection. Now go check out how inferior training is killing Russian pilots, or click this other video instead.